Humans are now living longer than ever before. In just a century, American life expectancy has gone from 47 to 79 years in 1 century. Today's scientists are growing hearts in the lab, creating organs with 3D bioprinters, bodily organs, and eliminating cells that shorten life, eliminating them. Will this new technology yield another dramatic increase in life expectancy? Is it a good idea? That's a question that some people are asking. So, let me introduce our guests. Our first guest is the Director of Regenerative Medical Research and Director of the Center for Cell and Organ Biotechnology at the Texas Heart Institute in Houston. Please welcome Doris Taylor. Our next guest is the Director of the Robert and Arlene Kogod Center on Aging at the Mayo Clinic and Noaber Foundation Professor of Aging Research. Please welcome James L. Kirkland. Our next guest is a novelist, a blogger, a syndicated columnist, a media commentator, and expert in international affairs and biotechnology policy. Ladies and gentlemen, Jamie Metzl. And our final guest for this evening is the William Davis Jr., MD, Professor of Medical Ethics and Chief of the Division of Medical Ethics at Weill Cornell Medical College. Please welcome Joseph Finns. And we're going to start with the question, what is biological aging? And why should we study it? Let me start with you, Doris.
Well, I think biologic aging is really a function of the age of our cells. You know, I may act 20 some days, but my cells know they're not. That being said, I think biologic aging is really a culmination of stress, emotional, mental, physical parameters that impact every aspect of our body, and including not just our cells, but our organs and tissues.
James?
I think one of the views in the field is that there are a number of processes which determine your physiologic age or your biologic age as opposed to your chronological age, which can be quite distinct. So when you think of children, they're really quite similar at a particular chronological age. You know, a kid in kindergarten is very much like another kid in kindergarten, and they view a kid in grade 1 as being a lot older than they are, almost the same age as their parents. When people are in their 20s, they're becoming a little more distinct, but they may be at the same level of university, but there are some differences appearing. When you get to people in their 80s and 90s, because amongst other things, I'm a geriatrician, I see these people. You know, many of us are approaching that age, and our parents and grandparents have been through this. There are some 85-year-olds who are out there playing 36 holes of golf a day, and others who have 20 different conditions and are on 30 different drugs. So biologic age and chronological age diverge quite a bit as you get older. And really what biological age predisposes to are the major age-related chronic diseases. The highest risk factor for having a heart attack, for example, is your age, and more specifically your biological age.
And a brief one-sentence definition then of biological age?
Well, at the fundamental level, there are you can bin or group these processes in various different ways, but one way I simplistically like to think of it that applies across many organisms is a degree of inflammation of tissues, cellular senescence, which we'll probably talk about a bit later, problems with large molecules like DNA, proteins, lipids, sugars, and also organelles within cells, and then stem and progenitor cell dysfunction. You find these processes are highly linked to each other. You use drugs that target one, you tend to affect the others, or single gene mutations. And they tend to be conserved across many species, although not every process is conserved in all species.
All right, we'll come back to that. Jamie?
Because aging is very complex and multifactorial, it's really hard. There's no standard definition of what biological age is. That we know, as Jim said, that different people age at different rates. We know that different parts of our body age at different rates. And so while there are these two things, chronological age and biological age, one of the big challenges in this field is to establish some kind of uniformity for what biological age is. And the reason that's important is because we're going to talk about these different types of interventions. But we need to be able to benchmark what is succeeding and what is not succeeding. And so biological age, we can understand it conceptually, but really making it real in a way that's going to allow us to compare different types of treatment, that's the gold standard, and we're not there yet.
Joe?
And I think age is not just a biological construct, it's a social construct. And when you start expanding the life cycle, and you start interrupting one person's life with another life in a sequence of generational issues, I think we're going to have a lot to talk about what it means for social disruption. And I think
What do you mean, what it means for social?
well, I mean, as a faculty member at a medical school, and the tenure age keeps on going older and older and older, there's a whole cohort of adjuncts who want my job, right? So that's what happens when you expand the life expectancy of professors. And is that a good thing for the academy, or is it a good thing for society? So I think my sense of it is I'm a big fan of the work that folks are doing here. But I think a useful construct is what we call fair innings. That if somebody has a life that's shortened because of a premature illness and they're not going to get their full 9 innings, we want to, extend the life to fair innings. But when you start getting into extra inning games, the next day is really difficult when you have to play again. So I just think we need to think about the context, the broader context of when we change individuals, and we change a lot of individuals, what are we doing to the group? What are we doing to society?
But I think that's a really important point about a social construct, is absolutely. But how do we think about what the social construct is? At the time of the Roman Empire, average life expectancy was 25. As you said, Bill, in the introduction, 100 years ago, it was 47.
Right.
And everything was benchmarked against that expectation. It's like in Roman times, oh my God, you made it to 40. That was like a
right.
huge accomplishment. And so I also think that we have all of these structures that are just based on this one historic moment.
Right.
And as things change, those structures will also change.
I think that, just quickly, I think there's a question of radical disruption and how fast can you accommodate the change. And the other question is, who will get the enhancement?
Well, I was just going to say that I think a lot of what many of us are trying to do is not necessarily extend life for those extra innings.
Right.
It's to extend health through those fair innings. That really the aspects of longevity that we want to talk about are living healthy longer, as well as, the kids who call me and say, can you keep my mom alive? Or the parents who call me and say, can you help my son or
Right,
daughter?
and I totally agree with that, but the title of the session is Engineering Immortality, right? So, so I think we need to understand that there's a kind of a medical sort of Hippocratic,
Absolutely.
intent, and then how it's understood about we're going to live far longer than.
It's true, but I mean, Doris said in the green room, which isn't actually green, but that death sucks. And I think that when we have been socialized to accept death, and I don't think immortality is going to be possible for a very long time, if ever, but we've been socialized to accept death. We've been socialized to define our lives in relationship to death. But quoting again Doris, death sucks. I mean, think of all of the wisdom, all of the love, all of the poetry, everything that goes away when somebody dies. If we had the opportunity to extend healthy lifespan, I mean, all of the demographic projections suggest that around 2050 we're going to start shrinking again as a global public, and we would need to change social constructs. But how wonderful if if people could meet their great grandparents, and maybe we'll have to, you lose your tenure at 60 or 70 or whatever, but let's solve for that problem, not say that we have this infrastructure based on our current life expectancy, therefore everyone's parents and grandparents have to die when there's a lot of extra potential.
So to get more specific, to move to another topic, where are we now, you guys who are specialists in this, as far as targeting the aging process?
The idea in the field is if we can target fundamental aging processes, can we delay, prevent, or alleviate this constellation of age-related diseases as a group instead of targeting these things one at a time? If you cure heart attacks, for example, you are choosing to die instead a few months later of Alzheimer's disease or some cancer. It's a whack-a-mole situation. So why not go for these things as a group? As a clinician, what I'm worried about is my patients having poor quality of life, having onset of these age-related diseases that cluster within individuals. If you get one age-related disease, your time to the next one is 2.5 years. The one after that is a year. The one after that is 6 months. They cluster in people, and we've all seen that.
But
we need to target that and delay it, and that's what some of these drugs do that seem to work in mice, maybe, if we can get them to
I
people.
want to ask you about that in a minute. Doris?
so I think that makes sense, though. Endogenous repair fails. And as it fails, it doesn't just fail in your heart, doesn't just fail in your liver, it fails everywhere. And part of that is because the capacity for repair that we have, these cells, go down as we age. And those cells, the more hits you take, the more you use those cells, the fewer you have, the more likely 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 set things are going to fail.
I think that's part of it. I think the other thing that happens is you have damaged cells that aren't gotten rid of. So there's failure to remove cells. You don't necessarily need to replace them in some instances. There are damaged cells that don't get removed. They can become cancerous. They can produce things, senescent cells, very small numbers of them, produce factors that cause widespread systemic dysfunction. So if only 1 in 10,000 of your cells is senescent when they're transplanted, you get, in mice, you cause frailty for 6 months. You cause diabetes, you cause brain dysfunction.
Cells?
Well, you get improvements in some of these things. There are many ways of targeting fundamental aging processes now. There are at least, there are well over a couple of dozen drugs now that target fundamental aging processes in mice, and there are many more coming. The question will be, can we, say in an older person who's got 5 different medical conditions, can we improve slightly 3 out of 5 of those conditions with a single agent?
Why is slowing or stopping aging a goal? Why is it a goal?
Well, I can answer that in 2 words. Why not? I mean, if we can live healthy longer, that's just a pure good, and extending health span and extending lifespan are correlated. So even if we say our goal is extending health span, that will very likely, at least in the early years, extend overall lifespan. And anybody who's been at the deathbed of a loved one or a child or a parent and asked the question, why can't we have more time? I think that if we can do that, if we can, what's the purpose of healthcare? It's alleviating suffering, and one of the failures of all of the miraculous work that's been done in extending lifespan is that we have more and more people who are in miserable conditions in geriatric centers or wherever. But if we can have people live longer, healthier lives, that's, in my mind, just a pure good.
Now, you said at the beginning of our conversation, you said something about we've been conditioned to accept death.
Yeah.
But explain that a little bit.
No, just you're born, and we have all of these rituals, and when people talk about death, I would imagine most people in this room, you say, what's the purpose of death? And many people would say, oh, it gives meaning to life. But would you like to have so much meaning in your life that knowing that you're going to die 2 days from now? Because that would really focus your love of your life, and the answer would be no. So we have all of these rituals, and we think about death, and we have all these words that we say. But if any of us had an individual choice of getting 10 healthy years with a parent, more healthy years with a parent or a child, I think everybody would take it.
Well, let me just toss an idea in here.
Yeah.
I've noticed that many cultures have different ways of categorizing and surrounding the notion of death and putting it somewhere safe. People who focus on death, who are not trained to do so, can get very depressed, and it can increase suicide rates, in fact. So isn't there something good about having ways to put it off in a safe place? And Joe, you deal with this.
Well, there's this great book by Ernest Becker from the 70s called The Denial of Death, right? And it reminds me of what a European colleague of mine once said about Americans. He says, they don't die, they just underachieve. And we are a fundamentally death-denying culture. And I think that I think no one is against this in a kind of medical way to kind of compress morbidity and decrease the burden of living with chronic disease. But I think there's a fundamental illusion of control here that we're not going to get rid of death. it will eventually catch up with us. Death and taxes, and I think it is part of the human fabric. And frankly, I think that the fact that we will die gives us some meaning to take seriously the time that we have, because it's not an unlimited gift. We want it to be a little brighter and shinier, but it's not unlimited. And I think we haven't been sold it. It is who we are. Immortality is part of our.
Yeah, I agree. I
Yeah.
don't think anybody here I don't think immortality, other than downloadable brains, which may or may not happen, is what anybody's talking about.
Right.
So, but I think that if we can extend healthy lifespan, then
Right, yeah.
great.
But let's for a moment, America especially is noted for this, you say. What is it about American life that has made us deny
I think
death?
it's extreme individualism, okay, almost a kind of libertarianism.
Control.
And in fact, the people who seek, say, assisted suicide in, say, Oregon, it's not pain, it's wanting to be in control in the timing and manner of their death. Everybody thought it was going to be pain and symptom management. It's an existential crisis, and it's the fundamental loss of control. And I would say that this effort here is part of that same social urge to have, control, dominion over one's life, one's death, and how long one lives.
But from a psychological point of view, you've got new ways of describing to us when it becomes unhealthy to deny it.
Right. I think when we see this, in clinical life, where people are asking for care that at this day and age is impossible, and issues of medical futility. Interestingly, the word futility comes from the Latin futilis, which means a leaky sieve. It no longer serves its purpose. It doesn't hold the fluid. And it's amazing how we seek to extend life, and people just can't accept the finality of it, and it leads to tremendous grief. And so, I think we have to be less dichotomous about this, and appreciate that there's a benefit here in compressing morbidity, but we're never going to get rid of our mortality.
I think we have to continue to talk, though, about quality.
Absolutely.
Because a number of the medical devices that exist, at least in the cardiovascular field, there are a lot of people who would say, yes, I want a device and I want to live longer. And they get that device and they realize the quality of their life is not as good as they thought it was going to be. And all of a sudden, the conversation changes. And I think we have to be able and willing to discuss quality. And I mean, this is what you do. Don't you deal with people who have quality issues all the time?
Yeah, as a geriatrician, what I see is that what people fear the most is loss of independence and control. And, myself and my colleagues in geriatrics, we're sick of providing better wheelchairs, walkers, and incontinence devices. So finally, the biology of aging in the last, since around 2009, has moved very quickly to developing interventions where we might be able to enhance health span. Even if it's a few months or a couple of years or something like that, it would probably add a lot more in some ways, arguably, than curing heart attacks. Because if you cure heart attacks, you're choosing instead to die, as I mentioned before, of Alzheimer's or some horrible cancer, because these conditions cluster. So our goal is to figure out a way to delay these things as a group, even if it's a small amount, and to try to compress morbidity. And these are potentially achievable goals over the next decade, because we can do it now in mice and other lower mammalian species. And the question is, can we get this to people in an incremental way, in a safe way, where we're dealing with targeting multiple conditions at once instead of one at a time?
And that's a really important issue, because right now we have a fundamental problem of the misallocation of resources. We're doing what Jim called the whack-a-mole. I mean, if somebody has cancer, you go after the cancer. Then they have cardiovascular disease, we go after that. But if we eliminated all of these diseases, even then people wouldn't live that much longer. But if you get rid of one, get rid of all cancer in the world, it's about 3.3 years extended lifespan. And so the question is, why are we spending so much on the diseases of aging and so little on understanding and targeting aging itself? And if
Which is the main risk factor.
Yeah,
for these,
exactly,
and
exactly.
the upstream cause, in a way, of these conditions.
Exactly. So right now, and every one of these diseases they're all terrible, and they all have pressure groups, and they all have an infrastructure for cancer, cardiovascular disease, dementia, whatever. And what needs to happen, at least in my view, and I think some people up here would share this view, is that we just need to shift some of that spending into understanding the basic science of aging. Because from an evolutionary perspective, everybody has this sense of what is and isn't natural. But the things that we think of as being natural actually aren't natural at all. It's not natural that we live to 80, just that our ancestors didn't do it. That's just this one period of time. There's nothing about evolution that has decided that we live to 80, because frankly, evolution could care less how long we live. If babies are getting eaten by tigers, babies would grow armor. If parents were getting eaten by tigers and they couldn't raise their babies, babies would become more independent like Komodo dragons do. But if an old person got eaten by a lion, it was bad for the old person, but it didn't really touch our evolution as a species. So there's a lot of fluidity in how we're going to be able to age, how we're going to be, in my view, how we're going to be able to impact and target the mechanisms of aging. And animal models are showing, as you guys has been mentioned, that there are a lot of things that can be done, I think should be done.
But I want to speak about animal models. I feel really strongly about this. We can cure anything in mice. We can cure cancer in mice. We can cure aging in mice. We can cure heart disease in mice, but we can't cure any of it in people. And that's because those animal models are healthy until we give them a heart attack. Or they're healthy until we do whatever. We don't have models that let us look at old, sick, taking all these drugs, also have cancer, also have all these other models where we have to test these things. So I think part of really figuring out how these work is testing them in real life situations. And I think it's important to understand women live longer.
And
Different.
this varies across species too, the gender differences. So
Right.
female mice don't outlive male mice.
They do if they have heart disease.
It's very situation dependent, and generally female mice have the same lifespan as male mice. In some other species, males outlive females, for example, in some birds. So this varies and is a peculiarity. One thing that does seem to be fairly constant are some of these fundamental aging processes, from yeast through worms, through flies, through mice. Unlike something like Alzheimer's disease, which is a uniquely human disease, or unlike atherosclerosis, which is almost uniquely human, does occur in some other species. Fundamental aging processes tend to occur across species. So there's some hope, and I think we have to have a lot of skepticism, as you're saying, until we do clinical trials. Right. There's some hope that they might be translatable. But as you're saying, we have to do the clinical trials, and we have to show this in people, because showing things in mice or rats or dogs or monkeys doesn't necessarily translate.
Let me see if I can get my aging brain to summarize what we've generally been saying so far. You're saying that more than going after individual diseases, go after aging.
Yes.
Right.
That's what you're all saying.
Yes.
What is the future? Is this regenerative medicine, or is it a new kind of medicine?
I think it depends on what you're trying to do. If you walk in the door and your legs, you've cut off your leg at the knee and you're bleeding everywhere, obviously you have to deal with that first before you can think about how old you are and what you got to do. And I think some of the disease states that we've been talking about, heart disease, other chronic diseases, we have to get under control. And as we develop new hypotheses about aging and understand aging.
I mean, I think there are two things. I think this falls generally under the rubric of prevention.
Right.
Right? But it's a kind of secondary prevention. After the process has already begun, people who are, in their 40s may not have had a heart attack, but they may have atherosclerotic changes, and could you reverse that through some, anti-aging intervention, versus an earlier public health intervention that changes the built environment, puts calorie counts on the food, teaches people about the high-fat diet. So I think it's important to realize the built environment has a lot to do with the process of aging. Some of it's going to be genetic, some of it's going to be environmental, but this is all under the rubric of a kind of prevention. And I would hate for people to think they could live whatever life they wanted to live, and then when they're 45 they could go check into the anti-aging clinic and get some kind of magic bullet, when in fact it's better to have a kind of a multifaceted approach to preventing the morbidity that's downstream.
What's the biggest intervention that I can do right now because I really want to live as long as possible? It's all of these things. You need to eat healthy. You
Don't
should
smoke.
exercise 45 minutes a day. Don't smoke. There's a lot of work on what they call blue zones, which are
Right.
part of the world where people live longer. And Dan Buettner and others went and said, well, what do they all have in common? And is that everybody had physical activity built into their lives. They were in communities. They had a sense of common purpose, and for whatever reason, they all seemed to eat a lot of beans. But having said that, and so everybody should do all of those things. But it's also true that in some of the metformin studies, for example, they had the two groups of mice. One were the mice that ate crap and didn't exercise, and one were the mice that ate good food and exercised. And then they gave metformin to the non-exercising, lazy, fat mice, and they outlived the healthy mice. So I think that you should do all of those things, but then there will also be, very likely be, in my view, other types of interventions that you'll be better off had you lived a virtuous life, but will help everybody.
And
Yeah,
some
but
of,
it'll feel like you're living for 7,000 years if you're only living a virtuous life, right?
Well, some of us enjoy it.
some of these interventions will see their first light in early clinical trials in roughly a half dozen areas. And some of these trials are underway at the moment. So one of the areas is going to be looking at multimorbidity. So if you've got an 85-year-old who's got 5 or 6 different conditions, can you partially alleviate 3 of those conditions with a single agent? So that's one approach. The second is going to be in conditions where there are accelerated aging-like states. So trials are beginning in people who've had bone marrow transplants, who've had massive doses of chemotherapy, and acquire this accelerated aging-like state in 3 to 5 years. Or the kids with progerias who look old when they're young. Another area is going to be where there are localized accumulations of changes that are associated with aging-like states. For example, pulmonary fibrosis, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is normally fatal without a lung transplant. Again, we at Mayo recently published a paper showing that these drugs that clear senescent cells radically improve mice in that particular model, and clinical trials are going to begin.
On humans.
Yes,
How soon?
very soon. Will these kinds of drugs reduce the amount of chemotherapy that has to be given, or reduce side effects of chemotherapy, or enhance recovery after surgery, or enhance recovery after pneumonia? Will they, and some of them do this now, one trial's already been done, showing that we can improve vaccine response in elderly individuals to flu vaccine by giving these kinds of drugs, in this case a drug related to something called rapamycin, for a few days, 2 weeks before they get their flu shot. And these were community living, healthy, elderly individuals who normally have bad response to flu vaccine. It was greatly improved by targeting fundamental aging processes. So there are a bunch of clinical trial scenarios that have been gamed out over a 3-year period by a large group of aging centers across the country and involving Europe that included the NIH and the FDA. And so there are very short-term trials that could be done in a short period of time with subjects involved in the trials for 2 to 6 months to look at these kinds of interventions and see if they work. And those trials are beginning.
Well, this comes to the next question I wanted to ask about, is to have all of you give us a sense of what the next 20 or 30 years in this field look like. Where are we going?
Well, I'm the only science fiction writer here, so I feel the freest just to make stuff up, which I will do. So I think in the near term, maybe I'll do it in 3 buckets. In the near term, all of the kind of work that we've mentioned to this point, I think some of that will bear fruit. Some of it seems very promising now, and it turns out it won't work. But there will be a lot of things, whether it's rejuvenating stem cells or pruning senescent cells, or using blood plasma transfusion to trigger certain cellular responses, or all kinds of small molecules. I mean, a lot of these things that are undergoing, some of them will be realized. That's the short term. In the medium to longer term, I think things are going to get more, it's going to be more maybe ethically challenging, and the kinds of things which people, I think everything about these interventions, my guess is most of you in the audience will say, well, that's pretty good if I'm aging and you can do this kind of intervention. But in the medium term, we're going to use genome sequencing, and we're going to understand different genetic combinations that give you a greater shot of living longer. And I've written a book on the future of human genetic engineering and embryo selection, but I think that there will come a time in the not so distant future when all children, the majority of children, will be born through IVF, and those embryos will be screened, and they will be screened for certain outcomes. And your possibility of living a long and healthy and robust life will be one of those outcomes that will be screened for at the time when decisions are being made about which embryos, early stage embryos, to be implanted in the mother. I would think that is the medium term. And in the longer term, if we're talking hundreds of years, and again, I'm the science fiction writer, so take this with a grain of salt, if we do get to the point of downloadable memory and we can transfer our minds into some other medium, then we'll just have this fundamental question, is that us? So if somebody today has locked-in syndrome, and the only way that they can communicate is with their eyes, you would say, well, is that a person? I think that everybody would say the answer to that is yes. But if you transferred that person's brain into a functioning robot, and now that person could walk and speak and do all of those things that they couldn't do when they had locked-in syndrome, is that the same person? It's an ethical question, but at some point that may be the kind of, if we're really talking about immortality, that may be the question we're asking.
I sense all kinds of potential red flags going up in the back of my
As
brain.
they should, yeah.
And in the front of Joe's.
Well, I think let's start in the short term. I think the history of medicine is littered, with more failure than success, and so the classic immortal cell is a cancer cell,
Right.
Okay, that doesn't stop dividing. So I think that the risk of iatrogenesis and doing harm, primum non nocere, above all else, do no harm, should be probably at the forefront. And I think the skepticism about translating from animals to humans is indicative of that concern. Longer term, I think that there are issues of this social disruption, changes in longevity, health disparities, I think are a really big issue. There's a concern about changing expectations, the science getting ahead of social norms, social constructs. And this would be a classic story that we do all the time. We have a scientific advance, and then we're trying to catch up with it. We have a hard time now with genetic testing. And I'm worried about sort of the eugenic, flavor of selecting embryos. I think we're strengthened by our diversity. And there are many people in this room who are probably heterozygote for something bad. I would say everybody in this room is heterozygote,
Translation.
have a good gene and a bad gene. And so we were selecting for the good genes. A lot of good people will be left out. And I think that really worries me, and that hasn't worked out too well in history. So, and again, last point, all these people talk about enhancement. People who are in favor of enhancement, the philosophers, some of whom are mostly at Oxford, are the people who need to be enhanced the ones who are going to decide how we're going to be enhanced? Right. Again, it's the humans. So I'm very concerned. I have no trouble with the medical, utility, compressing morbidity and improving the health span. I think that's all terrific. But I start worrying about us engineering our future as a species in a way that's incredibly disruptive.
And this comes into the field of new understanding of post-neo-Darwin thinking about what evolution is. The old view, which was not Darwin's, was that it was just simply random mutations and struggling for the survival of the fittest and red in tooth and claw. The new view, I understand from what I've been reading lately, is much more complex, that we are a species that gets ahead not just by having winners and losers, but by cooperating. That a lot of cooperation and sharing may be what makes us so...
Plus epigenetic factors that are environmental factors, which are not inheritable.
Right.
So
Lamarck was right.
Right.
Acquired characteristics can be inherited. So this leads to a very difficult... Well, I'm glad you used the word eugenics, because we should be reminded. Eugenics was very popular in America in the 10s and 20s and 30s. And when they were sterilizing people who seemed to be imbeciles, and a lot of that was going on legally, eventually became illegal, but people who liked it went over and joined Hitler's groups who carried out experiments in Auschwitz, for example.
Yeah, but I think the science is advancing. And the science, it's not coincidental that Jim was talking about, the big advances over the last decade. We are at an inflection point in our science, and we're at an inflection point in our evolution as a species. And so for 4 billion years, our ancestors have evolved by the forces that you've mentioned. But right now, our science is beginning a process and of allowing us to guide our own evolutionary path.
Utopian thinkers have been saying that for centuries,
for sure.
right? It's not a new story.
Yes, but our tools are so much more
been saying
advanced,
that too.
and they're getting more advanced, and so. But we will still have these same
But the
ethical challenges.
decision-making has not gotten more
For sure.
advanced, is what I would
still
say.
human.
Yes,
Still,
that's
and
yeah.
the people who are in power and the people who are making those decisions have not necessarily gotten
It's-
more advanced either.
That's 100% correct.
In
And
fact,
yet,
we're in a post-enlightenment age.
we are
right?
we are heading
We
in
don't
the
believe
wrong
in facts.
direction.
We don't believe in science.
There's no
we don't
doubt
believe
about
in
that.
Scary time to
vaccines.
And
We don't believe in
A
vaccines.
plus B equals catastrophe.
I completely agree. I completely agree with that. And yet, the science is advancing exponentially. And so the onus, that's why these kinds of conversations are so important, is the onus is on all of us.
Right.
Because you can either stop the science, and let's say you stop it here, it's going to happen someplace else, or you can say, well, we better really get our act together. And if we value diversity,
Right.
let's have a conversation about diversity.
Back in the 90s, I was doing stem cell research when then President Bush said, we're going to eliminate embryonic stem cell research. And I remember getting called by the media and asked how I felt about that. And I basically said, the problem is, if we're only going to use the established cell lines, they were all established from rich white people who could afford in vitro fertilization. And guess what? There are only really about 12 of those that are any good. So we're going to make all our decisions about stem cells going forward based on 12 rich white people? That scares me, because diversity is what we need to understand biology. If you look at every one of just us who aren't that diverse, we're going to be different.
And another axis of diversity is people who have disabilities.
I couldn't agree more about diversity. Diversity is our sole survival strategy as a species, and has been from the beginning. So if we lose, if whatever people think is good, it's good now. It won't be in the future. And these ethical questions, that's the essence of the debate that everybody needs to be part of. This is not a debate for experts. It's not even a debate for just one day or one weekend. I mean, these are the questions, the fundamental questions about the future of our species, and that should be the top of everybody's minds. But we can't close our eyes to where this technology is heading, because again, we could shut this down in the United States. It will be good or bad, whatever your views are for the United States, but it won't have any impact whatsoever on the advance of this technology.
The fact that reproductive cloning happens, the fact that CRISPR technologies that you've all heard about, where you can actually edit someone's genes in real life, says and is happening in humans outside the U.S. now, is something we all ought to be discussing, and whether we embrace that or don't.
Yeah, and if you had a time machine and you went 100 years into the future, and people were saying, oh, we have this thing, it's made of code, the code is writable, it's readable, it's hackable, you say, oh yeah, I got you, it's computer code, and they'd look at you like you're crazy. No, it's biology.
Right.
It's biology. So we are developing the tools to write and rewrite the code of life. We may be wise or not wise in those applications, but we will have those tools.
And forgive me for asking this question, but we're talking about people who are lucky enough to know about all of this stuff. Do you think it will be something that can be spread to all humans everywhere without a lot of expense eventually?
Well, eventually...
Or will it leave a lot of humans just dying in terrible health?
I think that, again, it depends on what our values are. Right now, we have all of the food to feed everybody on Earth. So we have the clothing to clothe everybody on Earth. We choose not to do so. If we maintain the bad values that we collectively have now, that will be the case. But there are financial incentives, because eliminating, as Jim was saying, if we can eliminate or reduce the occurrence of these comorbidities associated with aging, that's going to be a huge amount of savings. If people are living healthy 100-year lives and then dying relatively quickly, that's going to free a lot of resources that can be invested in all sorts of things.
There's a phenomenon, there are people who are what we call supercentenarians. These are people who live to a very advanced age. This tends to be inherited in families. And one of the interesting things about these people who are dying at 105, 110 is that when you look at large numbers of them, they live very, very healthy and independent, and they tend to be dead within 6 months of their first visit to a doctor. So they die very quickly. We also notice this in experimental animals that are treated with some of these kinds of interventions, or where single gene mutations have been used that have an effect on lifespan. There are also some data from about 20 years ago that came from studies of health utilization, that the last 2 years of life are the most expensive.
Right.
The last 2 years of life of a person who dies at 70 costs 3 times the last 2 years of life of someone who dies at 100. And that may in part be because of this rectangularization of morbidity. So I've got a shorter term view of some of this. I've got patients here and now. My view is I want to extend their health span and delay the onset of these diseases, and it's turning out now that these interventions will actually treat some of these diseases once they're established, including frailty
That's it.
in animals.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Health span. You've used that term twice. A lovely phrase. Health span as opposed to lifespan.
Yes, so health span is a period during life when people are living independently, free of pain, free of disability, basically able to do what they want to do. So the goal of the field, as far as I can read it from my vantage point, is that we want to improve health span, and if lifespan is increased, that's a side effect.
So a question about the fact that these things seem to run in families. Parents, grandparents going back that way. But is it necessarily something that runs in families because it's passed down genetically, or genetically and epigenetically, or both of those plus culturally, and just something about the lifestyle?
This has been noted across populations in different countries. And I'm talking about people who live way beyond 100. So there are several trials looking at these kinds of populations going on around the world. There's a high heritable component, but it's not everything. So of course there are going to be epigenetic and social and other kinds of factors involved. But some of the genetic changes that account for or contribute to this increased longevity within families are beginning to be worked out. There are about a dozen polymorphisms, we call them, that have been found so far, and they make sense because they follow the same pathways as food restriction, which extends lifespan in many species, and they contain the targets of these kinds of drugs that are being developed that affect lifespan.
So that sounds hopeful. Like, eventually you may be able to get to understand this well enough to be able to spread the knowledge to everybody on the
That's
planet.
the idea, and as we were talking about before, some of the early drugs that may have an effect, and don't take these drugs. We haven't done the trials yet. Don't take these drugs.
They're all taking their paper out.
It happens every time.
Yeah.
Somebody says, "Where do I get it? What's the dose?"
Don't do it. But some of them are very, very cheap, like metformin that we were
Right.
talking about before, 2 to 5 cents a pill. So if we are able, and in the next iteration, after we do these short-term kinds of studies and look at individual indications and see if they, in aggregate, line up with the possibility we're targeting fundamental aging processes, we may move to a kind of preventive strategy. And if that happened to work, it would, by projections that have been done by a variety of groups, reduce healthcare costs enough that the intervention itself would be relatively much cheaper for any society.
Can I just, maybe you guys could just talk a little bit about the role of inflammation in aging, because I think that would be really interesting to kind of get on the table.
Well, chronic, what we call sterile, that is in the absence of bacteria or viruses, low-grade inflammation is something that you find in many tissues and at sites of age-related disease. So this is where immune cells go in that release factors that cause dysfunction. Senescent cells act in part by producing a lot of inflammatory factors and also attract cells from the immune system in. And these kinds of factors will also poison stem and progenitor cells and cause them to dysfunction, and can contribute to macromolecular dysfunction, problems with DNA and proteins. So all these things are sort of interlinked. But this kind of inflammation is a very special inflammation. It's not the kind of inflammation you would treat with a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug or with aspirin. Although aspirin does in mice, and related drugs, salsalate, does have some effect on median lifespan, at least in lower mammals. What we're talking about is inflammation that's much more specific and of a particular type. And metformin is one of the drugs that targets that kind of inflammation. Rapamycin is another one that does it. So these are inflammatory mediators produced by senescent cells, something called the senescence-associated secretory phenotype. Long word, we call this SASP. And metformin acts in part by targeting that pathway.
Doris?
So I wanna speak to that though, because my worldview is slightly different, which is that acute inflammation is a good thing. Acute inflammation is when an injury occurs and basically your body is producing a signal saying, hey, there's an injury and I need repair, whatever that repair happens to be. And I happen to believe part of that is these cells that you recruit. And they're not all stem and progenitor cells. Some of them are immune cells. So you get those cells there. A number of years ago, we started, and if you get those cells there, you turn off the inflammation. If you don't, your body ramps up inflammation. And I think it's like your body saying, I said I've got an injury, send me cells. And you start recruiting the wrong cells and getting a secondary pro-inflammatory effect. And a number of years ago, when people started doing stem cell therapy trials that were primarily bone marrow derived stem cells, and so many of you may have heard, you get bone marrow from your hip, you take the cells and you give them, and you're giving stem cells. Well, only 3% of the cells in our bone marrow are stem cells. The other 97% are not stem cells, they're immune cells or other types of cells that are going to give rise to blood cells or etc. And when we started measuring those and said, which cells that are present associate with repair, guess what? It wasn't the stem cells, it was the immune cells. So there's a whole response to inflammation that is, stem cells and the cells we give turn down inflammation reproducibly. Acute inflammation's great, long term
in a moment,
it's
I'm going
bad.
to open this up to questions from the audience. But I want to ask one question. Is it possible that that death has an advantage for the evolution of the species because it means the young have to take over at a more frequent rate if death comes sooner?
There are some situations where that's true. To use technical terms, there are three kinds of late life history. One of them is no senescence, basically, or no sort of classic biological aging. Another is what we call seminal parity. That means giving birth once. And another is iteroparity. That means giving birth multiple times. So in some plants, in some animals, if you do the right things, if evolutionarily or the environment changes the right way, you will find individuals die upon reproduction. So dandelions do this in a lot of annual plants. Pacific salmon species do this, where the rainbow trout, which is actually a salmon, doesn't. And so very quickly in evolutionary terms, you can turn a species from being iteroparous, that is giving birth multiple times and then having a senescent phase and dying, to dying upon reproduction. And you do that, one of the ways you can do that in fruit flies, which normally are what we call iteroparous. You can make them semiparous in forced evolutionary experiments in the laboratory by restricting their food. So there's an advantage to having post-reproductive individuals die very quickly under that special circumstance. And you can find a cause of death. For example, in the salmon, they get massive production of corticosteroids from their adrenal glands, which kills them after they spawn upon going up a stream. You remove their gonads and their adrenals, and they'll live 25 years instead of 2 to 4 years. So it can happen.
So this sort of gives us new framework to think about where we may be going with the science that you all are specialists in. If you're giving us as humans, the choice about what we want to make our particular lifespan. We might choose to want to have necessarily a younger generation take over every 150 years.
Yeah, well, 2 points on that. One, just to follow up on Jim's very interesting point. If you want to live longer, eunuchs live longer than non-eunuchs.
Women who get pregnant 1, 2, or 3 times actually live longer. Beyond 3 times, mortality goes up. It's a J-shaped curve for mortality.
Yeah, and I'd like to put in a plug for wisdom. There was some recent research about killer whales where they found out that it was the oldest woman in the pod was the leader because she had all of this information that had been stored up over the years. So if we have a thing where people are living longer, then that's great. And if we have a social issue of tenure or whatever, let's solve for that issue. But like how much investment goes into every human, a lifetime of experience and knowledge. And if we could unleash that capacity of all of these older people who now are having dementia, they can't communicate and they can share, and we find a structure that allows us to have new
Let's go
opportunity.
back to the blue zone, though.
Yeah.
It was community
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
associated to the greatest degree with longevity.
Yeah.
All right. Questions?
There are some futurists who think that the singularity is near, namely that we are approaching a stage where AI, artificial intelligence, is going to take over. They'll become more evolved than we are. And some of them, Ray Kurzweil, for example, think that that is really near. So it is possible that biological intelligence is a relatively short-lived phase in the life of civilizations, only to be taken over by some form of AI.
Any thoughts
Well,
here?
let me be the first to respond to that, just because, like I said, I'm a science fiction writer, and my last book, Eternal Sonata, has a blurb from Ray Kurzweil on the cover. But what he means by singularity is just that machines become self-replicating. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that the machines will take over. It just depends on what the code says. So we better write that code carefully. But
Develop consciousness.
yeah. So
Self-replicating consciousness.
but we will for sure. Our biological evolution is a way station in our overall evolution. We will co-evolve we are already co-evolving with our technology. We will continue to co-evolve, and we will become a hybrid species. That doesn't mean we won't have values. That doesn't mean we won't be asking these ethical questions. But we are going to have to do it in the context of a changing world that will be very much, but not entirely, driven by technology.
Question.
If you have a heart disease, maybe you could change your heart, or maybe you could change your kidneys. But I could see a limitation related with your brain, because I could see the cells in the brain are different. You can regenerate these cells.
Yes.
So you know, like when you are 60 years old, or around this age, the cognitive process started to go down. So it was in the future about immortality. Brain is a burden. So what is happening right now nowadays? How you could in the future improve your brain?
These drugs are improving cognitive function in old mice.
I mean, it's the same story, different target organ. You know, it's all of our organs are affected. Our brain, just the consequences are different.
And there's been cognitive enhancement using
Right.
deep brain stimulation in Parkinson's disease in
Right.
some patients as well. So
And stem cells
stem-
for traumatic brain injury and stroke.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about parabiosis, but they have these things that people have been doing for hundreds of years, actually, where you get an old mouse and a young mouse, you cut them open and stitch them together, and then over time, the old mouse becomes young in many ways, and the young mouse becomes old in many ways, and its skin, its muscle, but also sadly for these mice, it's not pleasant, but when they biopsy their brains, the old mice's brains have become in many ways younger.
All right,
So pregnancy is the ultimate parabiosis, and that's part of why we think that there's a benefit for a few pregnancies,
Yeah.
because you share all of those things, but then over time, the stress of pregnancy wins.
And it's a thing we all kind of makes sense intuitively to people that you're like an adult and you can have a baby. But it's when you think about it, it's like, that's really weird. Like I'm whatever 30 years old, and then you've created a thing that's
And that's
zero.
why women's
Yeah.
immune systems have to be different, and
Yeah.
inflammation is different.
Yeah.
If
And
ours
it's
weren't,
meiosis.
we
It's
would
the
never.
genius of meiosis, right? That re-scrambles the deck,
Yeah.
and it's not
And
engineering.
so we have that
Yeah.
capacity within ourselves.
All right, another question, this gentleman right here.
This might be for Jim, but there's a lot of impressive research going on in terms of regeneration of tissue and organs. But I was wondering, is there the population just predisposed to have a certain percentage of people with Alzheimer's? What's being done for the old gray matter and the brain in terms of extending the quality of life? Jim.
Well, funding for Alzheimer's research has taken off recently. That is an area where there's been a considerable injection of funding in. The area is becoming, under the surface, there's a lot more progress being made than people, I think, realize. That should hit, there's some very interesting clinical trials, one of which there'll be some results from next year. So that field is moving faster than I think the public realizes. We have to bear in mind that the brain is part of the body. It's not a separate thing. And so some of these processes that affect other organs or have general systemic effects are also going to affect predisposition to Alzheimer's and related disorders. But
Right.
I think a lot could happen soon. I hope.
This gentleman way at the back is so patiently waited.
So to circle back to kind of what we opened with, talking about where the last 100 years has gone in terms of age, what is the community or even individually your personal opinions where the next 100 years will leave us, or what do you guys expect the numbers to increase to?
Yeah, and let's get an answer from each of these panelists, and that'll be the way we'll end. Doris?
My sense is that tools are going to get more. Tools are going to get cheaper. Hopefully, we're going to disseminate things more broadly, and the ethics are going to have to come into it.
Jim?
I think once you go beyond 5-year predictions, you start getting into muddy water. By 10 years, you're often wrong. By 20 years predictions, you're just about always wrong. So I hate to think of making predictions about what will happen 100 years from now.
I'm in the business of making predictions about what will happen 100 years from now, so I will take a swing at it. So over the last 100 years, average lifespan has extended by 3 months per year. So if let's just say we keep that going for another 100 years, then that's plus 25 years of average life expectancy. I think that when we look at the exponential increase of all of these technologies with biology becoming information technology, in 100 years, the amount of change between now and 100 years from now will be 50, 60, 100 times more than the change over the last 100 years, and that's only going to get faster. So I can't say specifically what's going to happen, but we are going to see life and biology and a lot of things very differently in 100 years than we do now.
Could I just add to that
Yes.
quickly? One of the things to also be cautious of is scaling. So although we can increase a mouse's a lifespan in mice by 75 or 80%, that translates into a certain number of months. If we go to people, would we have an effect on life or health span that would be a 75 or 80% increase, or would it be a 10-month increase? So there are a lot of scaling issues.
Go online and look at a medical journal from 1917 and read how confidently they thought that their new innovations, what they were going to do for our generation. And I think what that sort of retrospective does is should give us all a sense of humility, great encouragement about the promise of this work, but going forward with a sense of humility about the mystery and the complexity of this biology that we're just beginning to unpack.
And yet when you compare the whole suite of technologies available now to 100 years ago, it's unimaginable. And so I think if you
100 years from now, there'll be a panel just like this, and a guy just like me and a guy just like you will be having the same debate.
No, but
I'm
this
sure.
guy's going to be plugged into the cloud and have all kinds of super intelligence.
So what that argues is technology continues to increase like
Yes.
that. Biology is kind of a lot slower.
But I think those trend lines are going to merge. That we're going to turn, as I mentioned before, our biology into a form of IT, and then all bets are off.
Well, I'd like to acknowledge we've had an astonishingly great panel with a great depth of knowledge and experience.
Good job, Jordan.